Hi friends, and my name is Trish Roberts and you're watching Faint Signals from Bega. So I just wanted to do a brief video about the recent interview with Tulsi Gabbard on The View and the ABC television program. So I'm going to show you it now, and then you'll probably be able to see what I mean when I make just a few points.
I'm going to ask you what we always ask everybody who's running here. Why? Why are you doing it?
You have that crazed look in your face. You know, after 9/11, like so many Americans, I wanted to do something to serve and protect our people and our country. So I enlisted in the Army National Guard, volunteered to deploy to Iraq, and in 2012, along with now Senator Tammy Duckworth, became one of the first female combat veterans ever elected to Congress. It is those values of service before self that every soldier, every service member represents that I want to bring to the White House, to reinstill those values of honor, integrity, and respect to the presidency.
Very brave of you to join up like that. That's great. Thank you.
It's my honor to serve.
Sure.
Thanks.
Now, how did your experience fighting in Iraq shape your outlook of the United States' role in foreign policy? Because in my research, I found that you have a strict non-interventionist approach, and you are against the United States entering countries and being there for this sort of regime change.
No, as a soldier, I deployed with our brigade combat team from Hawaii. I volunteered to deploy with them to Iraq in 2005, which was the height of the conflict there. I served in a medical unit where every single day I was confronted with, in a heart-wrenching way, the high human cost of war. Very first thing I did every single morning was go down a list of names of every single American casualty, every single service member who'd been injured the day before. And I had to see if any of our brigade soldiers were on that list, make sure they got the care that they needed, or to evacuate them as quickly as possible. But as I went through this list every single day, I was struck with the names and the faces of my brothers and sisters who were paying the price for this war. I was struck with their families, their loved ones at home, who were so stressed and so anxious for the well-being of their loved ones. It is those experiences of understanding and knowing firsthand the cost of war, both on our service members, on our veterans, as well as the cost on the people in the countries where we intervene, as well as the trillions of dollars, our taxpayer dollars that are spent on waging these wars, dollars that are sorely needed to address the very real urgent needs of our families, our communities, our neighbors right here at home.
So should we not get involved when we see atrocities abroad?
We have to understand, looking at Iraq, Libya, and Syria, for example, that there are brutal dictators in the world. And unfortunately, there are people who are suffering as a result of that. But in so many examples throughout history, when the United States takes action and intervenes and launches these regime change wars to topple these dictators, the suffering of the people in these countries increases. Their lives are made worse off than they were before. There is far more death and destruction. Libya is a perfect example. Muammar Gaddafi was toppled. Now, today, we have more terrorist groups in Libya than ever before. We have Libyan people, women and children, being sold in open markets as slaves. So while these wars
we didn't have before when he was there?
Which didn't exist before.
No?
And so while let's just finish this one point, because we feel for the suffering of people in these countries, and we want to be able to help them. And so many of these wars are begun and waged from a place of humanitarianism.
Yeah.
But the reality is, and it's a harsh reality, that there is more suffering and more loss of life and more destruction as a result of these wars, which does not serve the people in these countries, nor does it serve our interests and our security.
Congresswoman, first, thank you for your service, which is something I say to everyone who has served that comes on the show, and I think it's important. That being said, My understanding is you know how I feel about your stance on foreign policy, and when I hear the name Tulsi Gabbard, I think of an Assad apologist. I think of someone who comes back to the United States and is spouting propaganda from Syria. You have said that the Syrian President Assad is not the enemy of the United States, yet he's used chemical weapons against his own people 300 times. That was a red line with President Obama. That is not our enemy. 13 million Syrians have been displaced. So when you say regime change is hurtful for the country, but gassing children isn't more hurtful, it's hard for me to understand where you come from a humanitarian standpoint if you were to become president.
Well, you're putting words in my mouth that I've never said.
You did not say that Syrian President Assad is not the enemy of the United States. Say it now, clarify.
The issue here is how can we help alleviate the suffering of people?
Just really one moment. Is he an enemy of the United States?
An enemy of the United States is someone who threatens our safety and our security. There is no disputing the fact that Bashar al-Assad in Syria is a brutal dictator. There is no disputing the fact that he has used chemical weapons and other weapons against his people. There are other terrorist groups in Syria who have used similar chemical weapons and other weapons of terror against the people of Syria. This is an unfortunate thing that wrenches at every one of our hearts. This is not something I'm disputing, nor am I apologizing or defending these actions. My point is that the reality we are facing here is that since the United States started waging a covert regime change war in Syria, starting in 2011, the lives of the Syrian people have not been improved. Their well-being has not gotten to a better place. Their suffering has not decreased. It has increased, in addition to the fact that al-Qaeda is stronger in Syria today than ever before. So not only are we dealing with the fact that this regime change war we've been waging in Syria has not helped the Syrian people, it has made their lives worse off.
Bashar
It has
al-Assad his people
it has
not helped
also
either.
undermined our national security, leaving us in a place where al-Qaeda is a stronger threat there than they ever have been before.
Tulsi.
And Iran has greater influence in Syria than ever before.
Tulsi, you and I know each other, and you and I have had these discussions and arguments over text and over phone. I've told you how much, yes, how we disagree. People text, right? I'm not. How we disagree on this issue. We've had it on the phone as well. I'm very troubled by the tweet about Venezuela that you've put out. We've talked about that. What Maduro is doing to the people of Venezuela. There's over 3 million that have been displaced. People are starving. He's not allowing humanitarian aid in. He is a thug. He is a dictator. He is corrupt. And I am very supportive of what the United States is doing right now, leading the solidarity and support of freedom-loving Venezuelans and putting sanctions, economic and sanctions. Why are you so against intervention in Venezuela? Not military intervention, but what we are doing.
Because every time the United States, and particularly in Latin America, has gotten involved in regime change, using different tools to enact that regime change, there have been both short and long-term devastating impacts. If there are ways that we can work with surrounding countries to try to get humanitarian aid into people there, then we should be doing that. But for the United States to go in and choose who should be the leader of Venezuela, that is not something that serves the interests of the Venezuelan people. That's something that they need to determine themselves.
But the U.S. is not choosing who's going to be the leader of Venezuela. It's millions of Venezuelans marching on the streets. But do you put military intervention in the same level that you put economic and diplomatic efforts?
The United States has used both military, CIA, sanctions, and other tools to intervene and enact regime change in countries around the world. Iran is a great example. The CIA led a covert operation to overthrow the government in Iran decades ago in Mossadegh. This led to decades upon decades of hardship and suffering and authoritarian governments, and has led us to the place where we're dealing with many challenges today from Iran.
We're going to come back with more from you because I think you have more to say on this than you should. I'm just wondering if this particular position that you take is going to be a popular one in the Democratic Party.
This is a position that I have found many Americans appreciate and understand because we understand that every one of us is paying the price for these regime change wars that are not helping people in these countries, and they're counterproductive to our interests at home.
I believe Trump said something similar when he was running. Did he not? Am I wrong about that?
He may have, but the problem is
not that he's doing it.
he has not carried through.
No.
He has gone back and has broken his promises.
I'm not going to talk too much about it. I think it's been covered enough in alternative media. People have passed various things, but I just want to say something about my overall feeling about this video, this interview. When I haven't watched The View for a very long time, but I remember watching it when it started around 2006, and I remember, oh, that's little Alia in the background there. She has a little bird be safe collar on. We're not dressing our cats up, but it works pretty well. I remember watching The View in 2006, and Rosie O'Donnell, the actor, was one of the panelists. There was only, I think, 4 panelists at the time, and George W. Bush was in office. And of course, it often is the case, mostly it's the case, that celebrities who are they're diehards for the Democratic Party, and if a Republican president is in office, they have lots to say about that, and but then they go to sleep when, say, Obama gets in office. And I remember that Rosie O'Donnell used to talk a lot about the Iraq War, and she had quite a few clashes with Elizabeth Hasselbeck, who was quite a clueless Republican. Now they have Meghan McCain, who's not so clueless, but is just as much a warmonger and is totally, a rich person who is just happy with the way things are. And she also has a very strong sense of American exceptionalism. Her father's John McCain, so that's in some ways no surprise. But anyway, back to Rosie O'Donnell. So she used to talk a lot about the Iraq War at the time, and she was quite upset about it. Then over time, then she left The View, and now, when Obama was in office, I don't think she had a problem with war. I don't think she really talked about it. Now Trump is in office, and all she can talk about is how awful Trump is, and Russiagate, Russiagate, Russiagate. That's all she can focus on, and there's no mention of the wars. Now there's actually 8 wars instead of the one, or I think it was 2 that were happening when she was complaining about the Iraq War. Anyway, two that she knew of. There are other things, other conflicts going on in the world, but they were the main ones that were being started at the time by the U.S. So what I find interesting about that, apart from the fact that she always seems to just go to sleep when a Democratic president is in office, even though Obama expanded 2 wars to 7, and he did a lot of other awful things. She just went to sleep during that time, but now she just talks about Trump. She doesn't talk about the war anymore, the wars anymore, plural, which is sort of, I think, is indicative of either that the Democratic Party has become, well, it's always been warmongering, but I think it's so much so now that all these people, all these celebrities, are almost afraid to be kind of put out in the cold by speaking out against war. If they at all think to do that, or they don't, they sort of think that whatever the Democratic Party does, it must be the right thing to do, and they don't look into anything at all. So fast forward anyway to this particular, what you've just seen. I don't know if you've noticed, but it was so quiet on that set. Like all the 5 women on the panel seemed to be almost afraid to show, and this is including Joy Behar, who is a comedian. She looked like she was petrified to sort of show any sort of approval of Tulsi Gabbard, to show any sort of any approval of anything she said. And the same with the others. They all look sort of almost like just like poker faces, and which I find really interesting now, because when the show first started, people used to have some sort of their own individual opinion, and they would different people would show different signs of approval if they liked certain things. But I think they were given almost, I would hazard a guess, that the panelists on The View, when Tulsi Gabbard came in for her interview, were instructed not to show any sort of approval, not to nod in any sort of approval about anything, and just basically sort of keep silent and leave it up to the two Republicans on the panel to interview her. And of course, Meghan McCain came out with something so rude, this Assad apologist thing. In some ways, I wish that people would, when a politician is called an Assad apologist by some of these interviewers, I wish they'd say, would you like to explain what that means? Because, you know, they should really explain what it means, because it's just this slur, this smear, which really is very loaded. But if you actually got them to explain what that means in relation to the person, in relation to Tulsi Gabbard, I think they'd have a hard time, and she could probably run circles around Meghan McCain on that one. And she managed to keep her cool. I don't know how I guess she just assumes that these people, she knows what the mainstream media is like when it comes to war. And of course, I'm not talking about Tulsi Gabbard in a favorable way in this regard, because I don't think she's problematic. I do think she is problematic. I think she's okay with a drone program, but she's sort of says she's anti-interventionist, but a drone program kills a lot more civilians than it does the actual targets that they're the so-called terrorists that they're seeking. So it's actually it's awful, really. And I have a feeling that they would manage to manipulate her into expanding things because Al-Qaeda, you know, which is sort of something they use. It's actually written into a bill that if Al-Qaeda is in a country, they can just go in and do whatever. I don't know. There's a few problems with her, and I don't want to go into that. There's a video I've done a few videos ago. I'll put a link to it in the information section, and you can look at it. It's an analysis by Eyes Left podcast about Tulsi Gabbard and her foreign policy. Anyway, but I was glad to see that Tulsi Gabbard this time was actually talking about the carnage in those countries, because usually she just talks about how awful it is for the soldiers and whatever, but she doesn't talk about the people whose countries we're destroying, Western allies are destroying. So that was an improvement. There's this default position of American exceptionalism, which comes through very, very clearly in these interviews, in this interview, which is that somehow the U.S. has to go in and help these poor people, these poor brown people that can't look after their own country, that their countries are in such a mess, and they have to go in and get rid of that evil person in charge. They have to go in and get rid of the evil dictator. Absolutely, there's this sort of white man's burden kind of thing. So they see themselves as, and they're completely clueless about the whole issue anyway. They don't know anything. They're just carrying on this. They've absolutely internalized this idea that the U.S. needs to be a world's policeman. You know, that's what they need to be, and it's absolutely essential that the U.S. is like that. Otherwise, the world would be in chaos. When in fact the opposite is true. The U.S. is going around causing chaos. These people are so clueless about what their governments are doing and what the Democratic Party is doing and all of this, that they just believe whatever the mainstream media is telling them. They've totally ingested the whole Russiagate thing and all of that. So, but it's amazing that in fact the opposite is true. You know, what what they believe when they think that the US is going in and rescuing these people that need to be rescued, you know, these brown people that are so primitive they don't know how to govern themselves and all this kind of stuff. And yet it's actually the US that has caused so many problems in these various countries and destabilized the whole Middle East and so forth. And is constantly warmongering and sanctions and all of that kind of thing, which affect the population. And you know, it's just sort of, it's like watching a Twilight Zone, or it's like black is white and up is down, you know, watching these kind of things. But the tension on that set, even from the audience, like, I found it really extraordinary how you would think, because a lot of Americans don't want war, apparently. This is, I don't know if that's true, but polls suggest that a lot of Americans want these wars to stop. I'm not sure if that's because, and I don't know if that's motivated by them thinking that this money spent on wars could be spent on internal, you know, domestic, you know, programs and stuff for them, which is actually economically not true. You know, federal taxes don't fund spending. If you understand the sovereign economy, the operational reality of a sovereign economy. But anyway, I don't know if it's motivated by sort of a selfishness of we want that money that's spent on wars for ourselves, or if it's just, which would be much more preferable, they want it to stop because it's a dreadful thing to be doing to these people in these countries that haven't attacked them, you know, governments that haven't attacked them. I mean, you know, like Tulsi Gabbard said in that interview, Assad hasn't threatened the United States or attacked the United States. You know, it's truly incredible, like, to watch. And also, I don't know where she got that idea of the 300 attacks, chemical weapons attacks on those people. I mean, I just know of the last 2 that were actually staged. You know, there was no proof. If you Seymour Hersh did an investigation into the one before the last one, there was, you know, it was, you know, it's actually the so-called moderate rebels, you know, the al-Nusra and people like that, terrorist groups that have been creating those chemical attacks, and they actually stage them. They film them, literally they film them beforehand. The one recently was filmed in Turkey, and they even used dead children that are actually dead, pretending to try and resuscitate them. Even a BBC reporter recently could confirm that the most recent one was actually filmed elsewhere. I haven't looked closely into that report, but I recall seeing that on, I think it was George Galloway, something like that. Anyway, but you know, it's sort of, they're staged, and it's just all propaganda. Like the white helmets are actually trafficking organs, and they're actually, you know, it's proven they've had photos of the same people who wear white helmets being involved in terrorist activities in Syria. So anyway, I'm getting off the track here, but these people, like on The View, these panelists, are so clueless about what's going on. In fact, if you notice that woman who was the other Republican, Vanessa, there's Meghan McCain, and then there's Vanessa somebody, I think that's her name. Sorry, I can't remember it. And her father apparently was in the Contras, and she's quite proud of that. Anyway, she said something to the effect of, if you recall, she said, it's not like our government is trying to, you know, replace their leader. She didn't even know that the US government, they've actually selected a leader for the Venezuela, Juan Guaido. She didn't even know that. I mean, these people on these shows are so clueless. Anyway, I guess Tulsi Gabbard didn't want to get into the weeds with that, and she probably realized how clueless these people are. So she sort of didn't challenge that clueless comment about that, you know, the U.S. government is not trying to select a new leader for them. That they actually have selected a leader for them. So you know, it's kind of, I don't know, it's so sad. Like I I find I get this knot in my stomach when I watch programs like that. I never watch programs like that, but I decided to because I wanted to see the sort of the tone of it, you know, see how it was set up and how they were going to go for the jugular, even though they were both clueless. Meghan McCain and the other woman, the other Republican, talking about Venezuela, they were so clueless about the whole thing and just sprouting propaganda, basically. The thing that struck me about the whole questioning was there was, on the video they showed anyway, I don't know what the whole show was like, but the video on YouTube, was how uniform the panelists were, how they seemed to be so afraid to show any sort of approval about anything. And Joy Behar didn't even know that there's slavery going on in Libya, you know, that it's way, 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 way worse. And I love the way they always, I mean, of course these leaders like Bashar al-Assad and Gaddafi, they are, every leader of a country is problematic in some way, although Jeremy Corbyn's pretty good, but he's not actually a prime minister yet. Hopefully he will be, but most leaders are all problematic. But the way they paint these people is like they're like these complete, like a totally different animal, if I can use that term, than what, say, Trump or Obama or Bill Clinton or, you know, George Bush or whatever. It's like they're a totally different species to the US presidents, who are all war criminals. But they talk about them like they're these absolute, like, Satanist type characters, you know, with blood dripping down their mouth, and just all they want to do is cause havoc and chaos and kill and kill and kill, you know. It's this whole demonization and vilification of these people, which is part of the whole racist, xenophobic thing, and also the exceptionalism. It's the American exceptionalism that is promoted. It's like, whatever we do, no matter what happens, no matter who is doing it, it's okay and it's for the best. And if something happens that is bad for the people, well, that was unintentional. Well, that's a complete lie. You know, they make out with this American exceptionalism as if everything they do is for the good of these countries, and that those countries need them to come in. I mean, it's so, the propaganda, it's at the absolute opposite to that. And sadly, these sort of wealthy celebrities who don't know their ass from their elbow, sorry, but they really don't when it comes to foreign policy and politics and stuff. They just take their cues and their talking points from the Democratic Party. They just don't have a clue. They just go along with that these poor brown people overseas need help. And, you know, and I mean, this is the amazing thing. Here she is going on, like, feigning concern for the Venezuelans. They're all starving. She obviously hasn't seen Max Blumenthal. And of course, these people would never seek out independent journalists, but she hasn't seen Max Blumenthal's. He was just yet today, he released this video where he's strolling around a supermarket in Caracas, and it's got everything in it. And he said it's not scarcity that's the problem, it's inflation. And it's due to the capitalist class there, you know, that's partly that's caused the inflation, and also the focus, you know, the incredible sanctions, the economic sanctions by the US and so forth. Of course, there's no mention by Meghan McCain about the sanctions. There's no mention, she just swallows whatever the media tells her to do. Next thing she'll be saying, people are cannibalizing one another. I mean, I was a victim of the propaganda about DPRK. I actually thought that it was so bad that people were actually, I mean, the reports, uniform reports from mainstream media, this is before I came across Breaking the Set by Abby Martin, and I actually realized how much is false and stuff. But I used to think that DPRK was an absolute horror story. And in fact, it's actually, you know, it's actually the opposite. They have free healthcare, and I mean, they have some problems, but they have free healthcare, and they have some quite beautiful cities, and they have public education, free public education, and it's actually quite amazing. You know, they've done this all on their own with all the sanctions and the blockades and everything. They're actually doing quite well in some ways, and yet, you know, you would think that they're cannibalizing each other. So, you know, that'll be the next thing that'll come out. Venezuelans are eating one another. And, you know, here's Max going around this, Max Blumenthal, he's an excellent journalist. Check out The Grey Zone on YouTube. It's really great, Grayzone. And he's walking around the supermarket there, and there's just everything, you know. There's just all this food, just normal, like a normal supermarket, stacked shelves. And he said, yes, it's really, you know, it's really, and, you know, toilet paper out the wazoo, aloe vera and chamomile toilet paper and stuff. I mean, you know, it just, and this is the thing, you know, it's like we have a smattering of independent journalists that are actually doing real journalism, and they're actually there on the ground. And then you have these massive, you know, like CNN and MSNBC and all those, you know, CIA talking points stenographers, Operation Mockingbird stenographers in there, just putting out this uniform message about what the government and the military-industrial complex wants them to put out. So, so anyway, you know, Meghan McCain, you know, as you saw, she was saying to Tulsi Gabbard about the, you know, the Syrians need our help, and Venezuela, and the other woman was saying, Venezuela, they're all starving. No, they're not all starving. They're not starving at all. It's very expensive, the food, because of a lot of reasons. And a certain amount of it is that the private corporations within Venezuela are holding the government ransom because they want the US to come in and take over and privatize. They want everything privatized. And so they're holding ransom some things, and the economic sanctions are crippling. And they rely heavily on oil export, and so the economic sanctions are just devastating them. And that's been going on for quite a while now. And now it's really, really desperate that things are very expensive, but it's no shortage, there's no scarcity of products. So anything that, you know, about Venezuelans starving, that's a lie. And this so-called humanitarian aid that this war criminal Elliot Abrams wants to send in there is most likely weapons for the opposition to overthrow the Maduro government. You know, it's just appalling, and it's so sad. Like, and I had a problem too with Tulsi Gabbard. She was basically not challenging, she wasn't challenging Meghan McCain or the other woman about, you know, like the things that woman was saying about Maduro, the panelist, was absolutely false. He's not a dictator. He's not a monster. You know, this whole vilification of brown people, you know, vilification and this racist sort of thing that anybody outside the US, any leader that the US doesn't agree with is a monster. Like, you know, they do that with Putin now. I mean, of course all these people have problems in some ways, but I mean, you know, when they carry on about somebody being a monster, it's because they will not submit to US empire. You can guarantee when they start vilifying a leader of a country in a major way, that it's because that country isn't doing what the US wants them to do. And that's what's happening. Like, you don't hear about any of these panelists going on about the dreadful things that are happening in Saudi Arabia, beheading people and stringing them up on cranes for everybody to see, beheading them in the town square. They beheaded a woman, she was an Indonesian maid, who's the person who hired her was trying to rape her, and she killed him in the middle of this rape, I think, and they actually beheaded her in a public square, and she was trying to fend off this rapist and ended up killing him. That's the sort of country that they ignore the human rights abuses there. These panelists also ignore the human rights abuses in their own country. Three black people are killed every day on average by the state, and they get away with it. You know, it's just a regular thing. They don't get prosecuted. And that they're using prison labor. It's for like, slave labor to make Victoria's Secret. There are countless human rights abuses in that country. The prison system is appalling. They're funneling people in there. They make it impossible to live. There's a whole bunch of nonviolent offenders who end up leaving prison with massive debt. You know, there's a whole lot of human rights abuses in their own country, and they cannot hold a mirror up to themselves. Here they are thinking that the US has to run around solving the problems of other countries when they have so many problems in their own country, and they are the center of human rights abuses in the world. Globally, they go around destroying countries, literally destroying countries like Libya. And if they had their way, they would turn Syria into that mess. And if they had their way, they would turn Iran into that mess. And if they had their way, they would turn Venezuela into that mess. You know, it's appalling. It's just this, they're like an insatiable monster, and these panelists have no clue, or if they do, they don't care because they benefit. They are very wealthy because they say all the right things. If one of them started saying anything that was anti-war, out they go. That'd be the end of their time on The View and probably everywhere else, because all these mainstream media are all uniform. They're all pro-war. They applaud war. They get excited by war, and they are down on anybody like people who talk about peace, like Tulsi Gabbard was talking about peace. You would think, this is the sad thing and the striking thing about that interview, which was the point I was trying to make when I talked about Rosie O'Donnell, is that not only have people just, the wars have become, they just have tuned out. The wars have become so normalized, and that those people on that panel, you would think one of them would have said, that's great, Tulsi, that you don't want to see these people in various countries in a worse state when the US goes in. You would think one of them, even say Joy Behar, which I think is probably the most left, and that's not saying much, she has some sort of sense. None of them sort of thought anything was good about what she said. And that's kind of frightening. It shows, you know, it shows how scarily censored it all is now, even on shows that pretend like everybody has a different view. Hurrah, you know? It's not the case at all. You just look at those women's faces and how they, like Joy Behar is usually very, very, you know, sort of, she used to be, you know, in 2006, very loose and cracking jokes and stuff. In the few times that I've tuned in for some reason to that show, you know, it's like her whole personality has been sucked out of her, and she just is as uniform as the rest of them in some ways, except I did see her have an exchange with Meghan McCain, John McCain's daughter, about socialism, which is not really socialism. They were talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and, you know, Meghan McCain almost blew an aneurysm in her head over Ocasio-Cortez, and Ocasio-Cortez, I'm not going to talk about her lack of any voice in foreign policy. She's obviously made a deal with the Democratic Party not to say anything about foreign policy, but she has some sort of idea about how we can pay for it. And Meghan McCain, the thought of everybody having anything extra, anything that's just the basic rights of like free healthcare, completely freaks her out. You should have a look at that video of her. Just search online for Meghan McCain, socialism, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, The View, and have a look at how she almost blows a gasket in her head over this. The thought of people having the things that they deserve, you know, and the thought of anything becoming more equal just freaks her out. It's really sad. And the thing is, you know, they're all vilifying socialism now. Like Trump is actually going out of his way to vilify socialism, which shows how threatened the ruling class is about, you know, and what's being put out there isn't socialism. Socialism isn't capitalism with a happy face. It's not. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's a democratic socialist, or a socialist democratic socialist, I think they call it. I know that some Maoists might have a problem with that term, democratic socialist, but anyway, that's what she is. You know, it's nothing radical. It's not socialism. Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist. They have socialist-like policies, some of them, like free healthcare and things like that. But socialism doesn't function in a capitalist system. It just doesn't. So, you know, this whole sort of distortion of what socialism is really unfortunate. And now the vilification of this pretend socialism by Donald Trump, and everybody in the Congress on the State of the Union address, we're all clapping, you know, this, heaven forbid, you know, socialism, ooh, you know. It just shows where these people are at, these oligarchs in Congress. And, you know, it's sort of like, but it shows, this is something that it does show, when you have so many people like Fox News and all of this, and carrying on, and the mainstream media, the liberal, the faux liberal mainstream media, carrying on about socialism and trying to dump on socialism, it shows that the ruling class and the oligarchs and all of that are very afraid that they're losing their grip on things, and they are. And that's something to be comforted by, that when, you know, when people protest so much about something, you know that they're afraid that they're losing their grip, and they really are losing their grip. Because as much as I find there's a lot of things about Bernie Sanders that is problematic, but something that he did do was change the narrative and wake people up to things that other Western countries enjoy, including my country, Australia. Free healthcare. It's relatively free here. It's not completely free now because neoliberalism is basically trying to kill it off and privatize everything. But, you know, to some degree it's free. Well, you know, the US, a lot of people in the US, I don't think realize that the things that they deserve. And so hats off to Bernie Sanders for that, for changing the narrative. And people realizing that there are things that they deserve and they should get that. I think that Vic Berger, if you've ever watched Vic Berger, Vicberger, he does these funny videos and makes them quite sort of strange about different incidences politically that happen. I think he should do one with this View thing, because it is kind of spooky, just watching it and seeing how uniform the panelists are, and how there wasn't one nod for any, that I can recall, one nod for anything that she was suggesting. There was dead silence about her wanting anti-interventionists, being anti-war sort of thing, and talking about people in other countries. God forbid, heaven forbid, you know, you should mention the people that we're harming. They're irrelevant anyway. They're the wrong color. And then the audience is dead quiet too. And I find that hard to believe, because there are a lot of US citizens that really want to see an end to these wars. A lot. I think the majority of US citizens want to see an end to these wars. I mean, Trump actually won as part of that. He's a major interventionist, right? He's a major warmonger, but during his campaign, one of his platforms was that he wanted to withdraw from these various wars. And I think there were, you know, the people that were voting for him, that was part of some of the things they were voting for. So, you know, there's a lot of people that want to see the end to these wars, and yet that audience was dead quiet. And I really have to wonder what on earth was going on there. So anyway, maybe they were taking their cues from the panelists, who were so deadly serious. I mean, it was such a tense, it was really uncomfortable watching it, I found. Anyway, you can decide for yourself. Please feel free to leave comments about it. I didn't pass everything, and I've probably forgotten some stuff. We could have made a lot more comments about the various, and stopped at various points and passed it all, but I just wanted to give an overall impression of it and to say how very, very sad it is that we're at this point where when a person talks about not interfering with other countries and not making it worse than it is, and wanting to withdraw from wars, that it's met with this, it's almost like, what are you, insane? I mean, honestly, you know, it's like people behave, those panelists behave as if it's an insanity and that you're crazy if you want to, that you would want to have some sort of peace and have less war. I mean, this is where we're at. Isn't that dreadful? I find that so appalling and so disturbing and so sad that that's where we're at in the mainstream media. This is the sort of stuff that they're putting out there. It's really quite frightening. I find that really frightening. That if you actually and if you're actually an anti-war independent journalist, you're either some sort of Putin tool, as if Putin, you know, it's like, you know, this whole McCarthyism and the Russia, you know, this baiting and stuff, red baiting. You know, if you want peace, you must be some sort of Putin troll or something. I mean, it's insane. This is where we're at now. Anyway, like I said, please feel free to leave your thoughts about that video and about The View and that particular segment, and please like if you like the content, and subscribe and click the notifications bell, otherwise you won't receive updates, and I'll see you next time. My name's Trish Roberts, you're watching Faint Signals from Viga. Till next time, bye for now.